frantic. A letter to God, written through tears. Titizo's asking for a miracle. God, please help me. I don't know what to do anymore. I can't keep going like this. My son needs a miracle and I'm running out of time. Please, show me a way. She closed her eyes for a moment and prayed with a sincerity that even she hadn't known she was capable of. Her body trembled as she left the letter on the altar. There, in the silence of St. Michael's Church, she whispered, "Please," as if speaking directly to a God she had prayed to many times before. Then, just as quickly, she stood up and left, her heart both heavy and hopeful. The quiet had never felt louder than it did in that moment. She had no idea that as she walked out those heavy church doors, everything in her life was about to change. Janelle didn't know it then, but her simple act of faith, her desperate, humble prayer, would set off a chain of events no one, not even she, could have predicted. Hello, my beautiful people. Before this story unfolds, take a moment and ask yourself, what would you do if the world you thought you knew was turned upside down by a single act of kindness? Every choice in life has its consequences, and sometimes it only takes one moment to change everything. If you're ready to witness a story that will tug at your heart and challenge everything you believe, then subscribe now. Comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Don't miss the truth that's about to unfold. It could change you, too. Tell us the lessons you have learned from this story. The next morning, the sun rose, casting long, golden streaks of light across the city streets. Janelle Glover stood in the small, cramped kitchen of her apartment, stirring a pot of oatmeal. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the otherwise quiet room. Jeremy was still asleep, tucked in under his threadbare blanket. He had been sleeping a little longer these days, a side effect of his medication, or the exhaustion that came from days of struggling to breathe. Janelle's heart clenched as she watched him from across the room. He was the only thing that kept her going, yet even that was beginning to feel like a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. She finished making breakfast and set the bowl on the table, but she couldn't bring herself to eat. The letter she had written to God the night before, the one she had left on the altar, lingered in her mind. Had anyone found it? Had anyone seen her pain? But she didn't have time to linger on such questions. Today was another day at St. Michael's Church. The job that had once felt like a sanctuary, a place of respite where she could lose herself in the act of cleaning, now felt like just another weight pressing down on her chest. Janelle slipped on her worn-out shoes, grabbed her mop and bucket, and walked out of her apartment, locking the door behind her with a heavy sigh. She had no idea how she was going to make it through another day, but she had learned to survive. It was what she did. When Janelle arrived at St. Michael's Church, the familiar scent of old wood and polished floors greeted her. The grand space was still and silent, the way it always was in the early hours before the congregation arrived for Sunday service. It was this quiet that she had always found some measure of peace. Yet today, as she walked through the door, it felt different. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. The silence was almost oppressive. She paused in the vestibule, standing there for a moment, allowing the stillness to wash over her. Her eyes moved slowly over the dark wooden pews, the flickering candlelight, and the towering stained glass windows. It should have felt familiar, safe even, but there was an unfamiliar tension in the air, a presence she couldn't quite place. She set her cleaning supplies down on the nearest pew and began her usual routine, sweeping the aisles, wiping down the pews, and mopping the stone floors. As she moved further into the church, something caught her eye. At the back of the room, sitting alone, was a man. He wasn't dressed like a typical parishioner. His suit was dark and finely tailored, and he had an air of quiet authority about him. He sat with his hands folded in front of him, staring straight ahead, though his eyes seemed to be distant, unfocused. He wasn't looking at the altar or the stained glass windows. Instead, his gaze seemed to be lost in thought, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Janelle's steps slowed as she watched him from across the room. Her pulse quickened. There was something unsettling about the man, something that set him apart from the regular faces she had grown accustomed to seeing in the church. He didn't belong. Curiosity gnawed at her. She was used to the occasional wanderer or visitor who came to the church to pray or reflect. But this man, he felt different. His presence felt out of place in a way that unsettled her. She shook her head, trying to push away the unease. Maybe it was just her exhaustion, the stress of her own worries clouding her judgment. She continued her work, but her gaze kept flicking back to him, unable to ignore the strange pull he had on her. The sound of a soft cough pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the man standing now, walking toward her with slow, measured steps. Janelle's heart skipped a beat. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly feeling self-conscious. Was he going to ask her for something? She had no patience for anything more today, not when her own life felt like it was crumbling under the weight of it all. As he approached, his gaze met hers, and he smiled gently. There was something both comforting and disarming about his smile, but it only added to the strange feeling in the pit of her stomach. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep and calm. "Are you all right?" Janelle hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I'm fine," she said, though she wasn't sure it was true. "Can I help you with something?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply looked at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as though he were studying her. Then, without breaking his gaze, he said, "I read your letter." Janelle froze. Her breath caught in her throat. "What?" she whispered, her voice suddenly a tight knot. "The letter you left at the altar last night," he said, his tone still calm, but now edged with something softer, almost tender. "It spoke to me. Your words. They moved me." Janelle felt her heart leap into her throat. No, this couldn't be real. Who was this man? How did he know? She had written that letter in desperation, believing no one would ever see it. It was personal, raw, her final cry for help. And now this stranger was telling her that he had read it, that he had been moved by it. The shock left her momentarily paralyzed, unable to speak. How did you know?" she asked, her voice shaking. He smiled again, his eyes twinkling with something unspoken. "I know you, Janelle. I know your story. I've been following it for a while." Janelle's mind raced. How could he possibly know anything about her? She had never seen this man before. The mystery of his words only deepened the anxiety swirling inside her. Before she could ask him more, the man nodded once, as though he understood her confusion, and turned to walk toward him, the back of the church. Janelle stood there, rooted to the spot, her breath coming faster now. Who was this man? And what was he talking about? How had he known her name, her struggles, her letter? Her mind spun with questions that had no answers. A few minutes later, Janelle was still standing near the altar, lost in thought when the man returned. He walked toward the collection box and dropped something inside. Then, without another word, he turned and left the church, disappearing into the afternoon light. Janelle's curiosity got the better of her, and she moved quickly to the collection box. With shaking hands, she opened it, and to her surprise, found a folded note. She hesitated, staring at it for a moment before pulling it out. Inside the envelope was a check, a large sum of money, more than she had ever seen in one place. It was enough to cover Jeremy's medical bills for the next year, maybe even longer. Janelle's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. How could this be? Who would do such a thing? Beneath the check, there was a small note, handwritten in neat, elegant script. Don't lose faith. Janelle stared at the note, her hands trembling. The weight of the check felt heavy in her hands, as though it were some sort of impossible dream, a miracle, a lifeline. Yet everything about this felt wrong. Who was this man, and why had he chosen her? Her head spun, and a wave of dizziness rushed over her. She was so overwhelmed by everything, the stranger's words, the donation, the weight of the letter she had left behind, that she barely knew what to think anymore. She had asked for help. She had begged for a miracle, and somehow she had received one. But as she stood there, holding the check in her trembling hands, the questions continued to eat away at her. Who was this mysterious benefactor? And what was it that he knew about her life, more than she could even understand? For the first time in a long while, Janelle felt as though the world had tilted sideways, leaving her caught in a whirlwind of mystery, faith, and a future she couldn't begin to comprehend. What had just happened, and what was going to happen next? The days that followed were a blur of contradictions. Janelle had walked out of St. Michael's Church feeling shaken to her core, her mind flooded with questions about the mysterious stranger, the inexplicable donation, and the words he had spoken to her. And yet, in the weeks since, something else began to shift. The small miracle she hadn't even dared to ask for had begun to unfold before her. It started with a subtle difference. The morning after the stranger's visit, Jeremy woke up earlier than usual. She heard him rustling in his room, and when Janelle peeked in, she found him sitting on the edge of his bed, rubbing his eyes. The sunlight streamed in through the cracked blinds, casting a warm glow on his face. He looked different. His cheeks, once pale and drawn, had a healthy color to them. His eyes, usually clouded with fatigue, were bright and alert. "Good morning, Mama," Jeremy said, with a smile that took her breath away. Janelle's heart fluttered in her chest. "Morning, baby. How are you feeling?" He stretched and yawned, then hopped out of bed with more energy than he'd shown in weeks. "I feel better, Mom. A lot better." Janelle blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. For the past month, he'd been so sick. His breathing labored with every movement, his chest rattling with each cough. She'd spent countless sleepless nights, holding him through his asthma attacks, praying for the medication that she could barely afford to be enough. But today was different. She watched him move around the room, standing upright, walking without stumbling, even running his fingers through his unruly hair. It wasn't just a small improvement. It was a transformation. Over the next few days, Jeremy's health continued to improve in ways Janelle could barely comprehend. His appetite returned with a vengeance. He ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner, each meal disappearing before Janelle's eyes. His energy was back, and he began to play outside, laughing with the other kids in the neighborhood, something he hadn't done in weeks. He didn't seem winded. His breathing was steady, his skin warm, and the coughing fits that once plagued him during the night had all but stopped. Janelle watched him with cautious hope. She still wasn't sure what to make of the stranger's visit, the money he left, and the cryptic words he had spoken. It all felt like a dream, a twist in her already surreal reality. But watching her son recover, day by day, it became impossible to ignore the possibility that this, whatever this was no coincidence. Yet there was a part of her that remained guarded. The world had never been kind to her, and miracles were rarely, handed out without a price. There was no way to explain what was happening, no way to make sense of it. It felt too good to be true, too easy. But as Jeremy laughed and played, her heart ached with a quiet, cautious relief. She let herself believe, if only for a moment, that someone, was finally looking out for them. Still, the questions lingered. Who was the stranger? How did he know? And most importantly, why her? It was Sunday when the next unexpected event unfolded. The morning service at St. Michael's Church was a usual mix of familiar hymns, solemn prayers, and the comforting cadence of Father Thomas's voice. The sun streamed through the high, stained glass windows, casting a kaleidoscope of colors onto the pews below. Janelle, as always, sat near the back, her heart heavy with questions, but still filled with that small, fragile hope that had begun to grow inside her. As Father Thomas made his way to the pulpit, his voice rang out, warm and steady. "Good morning, everyone. I have something special to share with you today." Janelle shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing down at her hands, her mind already drifting. She had never liked the spotlight, never wanted to be the center of attention. But today, the sense of something different in the air, something too heavy to ignore, made her stomach turn. Father Thomas cleared his throat, his expression turning more serious. "We've all been blessed in ways that words cannot truly express," he continued. "In our community, we've witnessed acts of kindness, generosity, and love that remind us of the true power of faith. And today, I want to acknowledge one of our own, whose strength and perseverance have inspired us all." Janelle's heart skipped a beat. The quiet stirrings in the congregation had her on edge, but she couldn't bring herself to look up, to meet the eyes of anyone around her. She was used to blending into the background, a quiet figure in the corner of the room, unnoticed and inconspicuous. Father Thomas's voice grew even warmer. "This congregation is blessed to be able to help one of our own in a very special way." Janelle's breath caught in her throat. The words were spinning, but the meaning behind them crashed over her like a tidal wave. She suddenly felt every pair of eyes in the room on her. Her pulse quickened. "Janelle Glover," Father Thomas said, his voice gentle yet firm. "You have been an inspiration to all of us with your strength and your perseverance. You've carried more than your share of burdens with grace and dignity, and the church would like to help. Thanks to the generosity of an anonymous benefactor, we are able to cover your son's medical expenses for the next year." The room fell silent. Janelle's breath caught in her chest as her face flushed with heat. Her hands clenched in her lap. The words echoed in her mind, but they barely made sense. She didn't hear the applause, didn't register the quiet whispers that spread through the crowd, because all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Her eyes flickered toward the front, meeting Father Thomas's steady gaze, and then shifting to the eyes of the congregation. The kindness, the compassion, but also the sheer astonishment. They knew? How did they know? How had they found out? Janelle felt like the ground beneath her was shifting. Her entire body was frozen in place. She wanted to stand, to protest, to tell them there must have been a mistake. This wasn't her. This wasn't the kind of attention she ever wanted or deserved. But then, as the congregation began to murmur, clapping and cheering, something in her softened. She felt tears prick at her eyes, not of shame, not of discomfort, but of something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Relief, gratitude. It wasn't just the money, it was the recognition, the acknowledgement that she wasn't invisible, that for once, someone saw her. The weight that had been pressing on her shoulders for years suddenly seemed to lift, if only a little. After the service, Janelle lingered in her seat, her mind spinning. The congregation had begun to disperse, chatting among themselves, giving her awkward, kind smiles. But Janelle remained frozen in place, her hands gripping the edges of the pew. Who could have known about her struggles? How did the church, how did Father Thomas know about her financial and medical hardships? She had never told anyone. Not directly. Not like that. As she made her way to the back of the church, trying to avoid too many questioning eyes, Father Thomas caught up with her. He offered her a smile, warm and reassuring. "I'm sure you're confused, Janelle," he said softly. "I just wanted you to know that there's a lot of love and support in this community. You're not alone." Janelle didn't know how to respond. Her voice was trapped in her throat, the words she wanted to speak tangled with too many emotions. She was grateful, yes, overwhelmed with relief, but also unsure, confused. "I don't understand," she whispered. Who did this for us?" Father Thomas's smile softened. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "It was a gift from someone who's been watching over you, someone who understands what you're going through. But it wasn't just about the money, Janelle. It's about what this community can offer you, too. Help, love, and support. You don't have to carry this burden alone." Tears welled up in Janelle's eyes as she nodded, finally finding her voice. "Thank you. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just know that we're here for you." As she left the church that day, Janelle felt as if she were walking through a dream. The heaviness in her chest, the suffocating weight of isolation and fear, had lifted just a little. But as she stepped out into the sunlight, she couldn't shake the questions that still rattled in her mind. Who had done this for her? Who had seen her pain, her struggle, and decided to intervene? And why? The answers didn't come. Not yet. But as Jeremy's laughter echoed through her thoughts, and as she felt the warmth of the church's embrace, Janelle began to allow herself the luxury of something she hadn't dared to feel in years. Hope. Janelle stood in the vestibule of St. Michael's Church, still trying to absorb the shock of what had just happened. The announcement, Father Thomas's announcement, had left her stunned and shaken. The congregation had clapped and cheered, their kind eyes turned to her with an almost reverent sympathy. But it was all too much. Her pulse was still racing, her hands still trembling. She had never asked for help in such a public way. She had never let anyone see the cracks in her life. She had always been the one holding everything together, making sure no one noticed how close she was to breaking. And now, here she was, standing in front of the altar, the entire congregation aware of her struggles, her fears, her burdens. As the last few parishioners filtered out of the church, Father Thomas approached her. His expression was kind, but there was a softness to his gaze that told her he wasn't just a priest, but someone who had seen through the veneer of her everyday life. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind, Janelle," Father Thomas said, his voice warm, but carrying an undertone of something deeper, something knowing. He gave her a small, understanding smile, like he could see right through her confusion, as if he had already anticipated her reaction. "I don't understand," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Who did this for me? For us? How could anyone know about?" She trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. She didn't want to say it aloud. She didn't want to speak the words that had haunted her for so long. How could anyone know how close she was to losing everything? Father Thomas took a deep breath, his eyes softening. "Janelle, I think it's time you knew the truth." He motioned for her to follow him. As he led her down a side hallway, away from the church's main doors and the departing crowd, she felt a tightening in her chest. It was one thing to be the subject of hushed conversations and kind looks. It was another to be asked to face the mystery directly. They stopped outside his office, a small room tucked away at the back of the church. Father Thomas opened the door and gestured for her to step inside. It was warm, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of incense. A desk sat cluttered with papers, and on the shelves, old books and religious icons lined the walls. "Please, sit down," Father Thomas said, settling into his own chair behind the desk. Janelle sat in the chair opposite him, still unsure of what was coming. There was an air of gravity in his posture, a certain weight to his words that made her feel like she was about to learn something she hadn't been ready for. For a moment, they were both silent, and then Father Thomas leaned forward slightly. "The donation that helped you, the one you received last week, came from someone very close to me. His name is Gabriel Thomas." Janelle's eyebrows furrowed. She didn't recognize the name. "Gabriel Thomas?" she repeated, trying to place it. "I've never heard of him." "No," Father Thomas said, with a small, rueful smile. "You wouldn't have. Gabriel left this town many years ago, and we've been estranged for quite some time. But he's back now." His eyes seemed to soften as he spoke, but there was a hint of something else. Regret? Longing? Janelle couldn't tell. Janelle felt the room growing smaller. Her mind was racing. But why? Why would he do something like that for me? How did he even know about my situation? Father Thomas sighed, looking down at his hands before meeting her eyes again. "That's the part of the story you need to hear, Janelle. It's not a simple one." Gabriel Thomas had once been a successful businessman, known in the community for his sharp mind and drive. He had built his career from the ground up, creating a reputation for himself in ways that few could match. But success, as Janelle knew all too well, often came with a cost. Gabriel had everything, Father Thomas continued. A thriving business, a beautiful home, a life that many envied. But then, everything fell apart. It started with a series of personal losses, the death of his wife, a business partnership that ended in betrayal, and, eventually, a crisis of faith. He became disillusioned, and he left everything behind. He disappeared, abandoning the life he had spent years building. For years, we had no word from him, no sign, nothing. Janelle listened, her brow furrowing. The pieces didn't quite fit yet. A successful businessman who had fallen from grace could barely wrap her head around it. But as Father Thomas spoke, something about the story rang familiar, though she couldn't yet put her finger on it. "Why would he come back?" she asked. "What brought him back to this town?" Father Thomas leaned back in his chair, as though the memory of his brother's return weighed on him too. "It wasn't something planned, Janelle. He came back unexpectedly, after all these years. He said he needed to reconnect with something real, with his roots, his past. He needed to find peace. That's when he saw your letter." Janelle's heart skipped. Her letter. The letter she had written in desperation, the letter she had left at the altar, expecting it to be nothing more than a release, a silent prayer. "You see, Gabriel had been watching you, Janelle," Father Thomas continued, his voice quiet but firm. "He saw the quiet strength you've carried, even in the hardest of times. He knew your story, not just from what he had learned when he returned, but because he had been moved by your letter. It was your words, your raw, honest plea for help, that touched him. It was more than just your struggles that spoke to him. It was the way you refused to give up." Janelle felt her throat tighten. He had been watching her. The stranger she had met at the altar had been Gabriel, Father Thomas's brother, a man who, despite his own struggles, had somehow seen her pain and responded. The realization hit her like a wave, a crashing force that left her speechless. "But why didn't he just come to me?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Why leave a check? Leave it anonymous? Why not just help me directly?" Father Thomas looked at her with a mixture of compassion and understanding. "Gabriel wanted to help you, Janelle, but he also wanted to do it in a way that didn't feel like charity. He didn't want you to feel small or indebted. He wanted you to have what you needed, but he also wanted you to know that you weren't alone, that there were people who understood, who cared." Janelle's mind was spinning. Gabriel Thomas, this man, this stranger who had offered help when no one else had. He was part of the very family she had never expected to be connected to. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair, and she could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. "Why?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Why did he choose me? I'm just a janitor at the church. I don't even know why I deserve this." Father Thomas's gaze softened, and he shook his head. "You don't have to justify it, Janelle. Gabriel saw something in you that you might not see in yourself. Your strength, your heart, your ability to keep going, even when everything was falling apart. He saw how hard you fought for your son, and he wanted to help. That's all." For a moment, the silence between them was heavy. Janelle couldn't find the words. She felt overwhelmed, a torrent of emotion she couldn't control. Gratitude, confusion, awe. But beneath it all, there was a sense of relief, a feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long while. The man who had left her the money, the man who had seemed so distant, so mysterious, was not a stranger at all. He was a part of a story that she hadn't even realized was her own. He had been watching, waiting for the right moment to intervene. Janelle felt a knot loosen in her chest as she finally allowed herself to understand the depth of what had happened. This wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about the medical bills being covered or the relief that had come in an unexpected form. It was about something much larger. It was about connection, about being seen, and about finding faith in the unlikeliest of places. "Thank you," Janelle whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for telling me. I don't know what to say." Father Thomas smiled kindly. "You don't have to say anything, Janelle. You just have to know that help and hope can come when you least expect it, and that sometimes the smallest acts of faith can change everything." Janelle nodded slowly, feeling as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly understood, truly seen, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of hope quietly stirring, a soft hum in the air, waiting to be embraced. This was only the beginning. The answers had come, but the road ahead was still unfolding, and Janelle had no idea where it would lead. Yet for the first time in a long time, she was ready to see where it took her. The church was quiet when Janelle stepped through the doors. The familiar scent of incense and polished wood filled her senses, a comforting reminder of the countless hours she had spent in this sacred space, cleaning the floors and wiping down pews. But today, it felt different. Today, she wasn't just a janitor. She wasn't just the woman who swept and mopped, tried to stay invisible, and kept her struggles hidden behind a mask of exhaustion. Today, she was someone who had been seen, someone who had been heard. She stood in the vestibule, her eyes scanning the empty aisles. The light filtering through the stained glass windows bathed the space in a soft, ethereal glow. The calm silence of the church seemed to wrap around her like a blanket. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt charged, heavy with the weight of something important, something just beyond her reach. For the first time in weeks, Janelle didn't feel the pull of the overwhelming weight she had been carrying for so long. She felt lighter, almost like she could breathe again, even though the questions still gnawed at her. The letter, the donation, Gabriel. How had everything changed so suddenly? And what did it all mean? Her gaze drifted toward the altar. It felt like a lifetime ago when she had knelt there, desperate and afraid, writing her letter to God. She had left it there, not expecting anything but a fleeting moment of solace. But now, standing here again, she realized that the letter had been more than just a cry for help. It had been the beginning of something, a transformation she couldn't yet understand. With a deep breath, Janelle walked slowly toward the altar. The sound of her footsteps echoed softly in the stillness. When she reached the steps, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the wooden railing. She could almost feel the weight of that moment from days ago. The way her trembling hand had placed the letter on the altar, her whispered prayer hanging in the air. It was then that she heard the footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate. She turned and saw him, Gabriel. He stood just a few feet away, dressed in a dark jacket, his eyes soft, but filled with something unspoken. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence between them almost tangible. Gabriel's presence felt both familiar and foreign at once, as though they were two people who had known each other forever, but had never truly met until now. "I've been waiting for you," Gabriel said softly, his voice low, but somehow carrying across the empty church. Janelle didn't know how to respond. Her heart was beating so loudly in her chest that she could barely hear the words she wanted to say. But in that moment, she didn't need to speak. There was something in the air between them, something deep and unspoken that transcended the need for words. Gabriel took a step closer, and Janelle noticed the faint lines on his face, the shadows of a man who had seen more than he'd let on. He was standing beside her now, both of them facing the altar together. "I've been here before," Gabriel continued, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "Many times, in fact. But this is the first time I've really seen it. Seen you." Janelle swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over her. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain the strange whirlwind of emotions that had consumed her ever since the stranger's visit and the donation that followed. But standing here now, with Gabriel beside her, she felt a sense of clarity begin to take shape. "Why did you do it?" she finally asked, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "Why did you help me? I don't even know who you are. Not really." Gabriel turned toward her, his eyes soft, but filled with something deeper. "You're stronger than you know, Janelle. I've seen what you've been through. I've been watching you from afar for a long time." Janelle's brow furrowed. "But why? Why didn't you just come to me? Why leave the donation? Leave it anonymous?" Gabriel's eyes flickered with something like pain before he answered. "It wasn't about charity, Janelle. It wasn't about me giving you a handout. It was about you knowing that you're not alone. I didn't want you to feel indebted to me. I didn't want you to feel small." Janelle felt her chest tighten, her heart pounding. "But why me? I'm just a janitor at this church. I'm nothing special, nothing extraordinary." Gabriel shook his head slowly, his expression softening. "That's where you're wrong. You've been carrying so much for so long, Janelle. But you never asked for anything in return. You just kept going. I saw your strength, your faith. That's what moved me. And when I saw that letter you left at the altar, your words, your raw honesty, something in me clicked. I couldn't walk away. I couldn't leave you to face all this by yourself. The emotion in Gabriel's voice struck Janelle like a blow to the chest. For the first time, she allowed herself to really hear what he was saying. He wasn't just some random benefactor who had swooped in to fix her problems. He wasn't some savior sent from nowhere. He was someone who had been watching, waiting, and ultimately understood her in a way no one else had. Her chest tightened, and she felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't know what to say. No words seemed big enough to carry the weight of the gratitude, the confusion, and the awe she felt. Gabriel turned back toward the altar, his voice becoming softer. I've been where you are. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like the weight of the world is crushing you, and no one sees, no one helps. But I want you to know, Janelle, you're not alone. You don't have to carry it all by yourself anymore. Janelle's breath caught in her throat. This Emma, a stranger, an enigma who had entered her life like a whirlwind, was now offering her something far more valuable than just financial help. He was offering her hope. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and touched the side of the altar. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered, the words slipping out without her even realizing it. Gabriel gave a small, gentle smile. You don't have to thank me, Janelle. You just need to keep moving forward. That's all. Janelle closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her bones. She didn't need to thank him. She didn't need to do anything to repay him. He had given her something far more precious than money or favors. He had given her the gift of knowing that she wasn't alone in her struggles. She was not invisible. As the moments passed, Janelle and Gabriel stood side by side, their presence at the altar a quiet understanding between them. Gabriel, once a distant stranger, now felt more like a kindred spirit, someone who had been through his own battles, who understood the quiet courage it took to keep going, even when it felt impossible. Finally, Janelle spoke, her voice low and filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. I don't know your story. I don't know why you came back to this town, but I'm grateful. Grateful that you saw me. Saw us. Gabriel nodded, his eyes focused on the altar as he spoke. I didn't come back here because of some grand plan, Janelle. I came back because I lost my way. I had everything once. But after I lost my wife, after my business fell apart, I couldn't find a reason to stay. I didn't know who I was anymore. Janelle turned to him, her heart aching with a deeper understanding. And the letter? The letter was the spark, Gabriel said quietly. It reminded me of the things I had forgotten, the things I had lost along the way. Faith, connection, the belief that one small act of kindness can change someone's life. I wanted to be part of that again. I wanted to give, not just for the sake of it, but because I truly believed it could make a difference. The silence between them felt profound, like a shared moment of healing, of understanding. Your letter brought me back here, Janelle, Gabriel continued, his voice a little rougher now. It reminded me of what I once had, and what I could still give. Janelle didn't know how to respond. There were no words that seemed to fit. But standing here, in this sacred space, with Gabriel beside her, she finally understood. Faith, even the smallest glimmer of it, had the power to change everything. And for the first time in years, Janelle allowed herself to believe that the impossible could be possible. that miracles didn't always come in grand gestures, but in quiet moments of connection, in the shared understanding of two people who had found their way through the darkness. Together, they stood at the altar, not as strangers, but as two people who had been changed by the simple, profound act of faith. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Janelle felt ready to walk it. The weight of the church's silence was heavier than Janelle had imagined. It wasn't the same kind of quiet that she had grown used to in the early hours, when the church was empty and the only sound was the rhythmic swish of her mop on the floors. No, this silence was different. It was thick, filled with anticipation and expectation. It pressed in on her chest and made it hard to breathe, as if everyone in the room was waiting for her to speak, for her to reveal something that had been hidden for far too long. The invitation had come only a few days before. Father Thomas had asked her to speak during Sunday service, to share her testimony with the congregation. She had agreed, of course. How could she not? She had always believed in the power of stories, of words that could heal, that could help others find hope. But now, as she stood in the front of the church, her hands gripping the sides of the pulpit, the reality of it hit her like a freight train. She wasn't just a janitor anymore. She wasn't just the woman who had spent countless hours scrubbing floors and mopping halls in the background. Today, she was the one in the spotlight, the one whose story could change lives, and she was terrified. Janelle took a deep breath, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the edge of the wooden lectern. The church was packed. More people than she had ever seen gathered for a Sunday service. She hadn't realized just how many people had been affected by her story, by the kindness of the stranger who had helped her. It was overwhelming to think that her small, quiet life was suddenly being shared with so many others. Her eyes scanned the faces before her, people she had seen for years, some of them friendly acquaintances, others just strangers who sat in the pews each week. But today, their eyes were on her. She could feel the weight of their gaze, but she forced herself to look past the fear and the nervousness that threatened to overtake her. She had to do this. She had to speak. Father Thomas stood behind her, his presence a quiet support. He gave her an encouraging smile, but it was clear that this moment was hers alone. She had been chosen to tell her story, to share her faith with the congregation. And despite the storm of emotion swirling in her chest, she knew this was her chance to give something back, to show others what she had learned in her own journey. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice soft at first, but growing steadier with each word. The familiar hum of the congregation's murmur died down, and all eyes were on her. Janelle cleared her throat and glanced down at the notes she had scribbled on a piece of paper earlier that morning. But the words seemed unnecessary. This wasn't something she had to read from a script. This was her life, her story. "My name is Janelle Glover," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "And I'm here today to share something with all of you that I never thought I'd have the courage to say." She paused, gathering her thoughts, feeling the quiet anticipation that filled the room like a heavy blanket. "For a long time I felt invisible, like I was just going through the motions, raising my son, cleaning the church, doing what I could to make ends meet. But no matter how hard I tried, it never felt like enough. I was always struggling, always exhausted, and I was scared. Scared that I couldn't keep going. Scared that I would lose my son. Scared that I would lose everything." Janelle's voice trembled for a moment, but she pushed through. She had to be honest. She had to let them see the raw truth of what she had been feeling. "And then, something happened," she continued, her breath catching in her throat. "Something I never expected. Someone, a stranger, came into my life and changed everything. He saw me, really saw me, when I thought no one could. He saw my pain, my struggle, and he stepped in to help, not because he had to, but because he chose to. He didn't want me to feel alone anymore. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. She wasn't about to let her emotions overwhelm her now, not when she had come this far. Through that stranger's kindness, I realized something, Janelle said, her voice quiet, but filled with conviction. I realized that no matter how small my faith might have been, it was enough. It was enough to bring me through the darkest moments of my life. And it was enough to bring me here today, to stand in front of all of you. She paused again, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment, giving the congregation a chance to absorb her words. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's not about knowing exactly how things are going to turn out. It's about holding on, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. And sometimes, faith comes in the form of a stranger's kindness. Sometimes, it comes in the form of someone seeing you, truly seeing you, and giving you the help you need, even when you feel like you don't deserve it. Janelle's hands were still shaking, but now it wasn't fear. It was something else, something freeing. She was telling her truth, and it felt like the weight she had been carrying for so long was finally starting to lift. I don't know why this stranger chose to help me, she said, her voice growing softer. But I do know this, that help, that kindness, has changed my life. It has changed the way I see myself, and it has changed the way I see all of you. She glanced up at the congregation, her eyes meeting the eyes of the people who had watched her from a distance for so long. She could feel their attention, their curiosity, their compassion, and in that moment, she felt seen. Not just by the stranger who had helped her, but by all of them. I'm here today, standing before you, not because I'm special, or because I have all the answers, she said, her voice steady now. I'm here because of the love and the support of this church, because of the community that has surrounded me, even when I didn't ask for help, and because of the faith that I still hold on to, no matter how small it seemed at times. The church was silent, completely still. Janelle could feel every pair of eyes on her, but there was no judgment in their gaze. There was no pity, no condescension. There was only something that felt like awe, like reverence, as if they were all witnessing something they hadn't expected. Father Thomas, who had been standing at the back of the room, nodded approvingly, his face filled with quiet pride. The congregation remained still, no one moving, no one whispering. It was a silence so heavy that Janelle felt like the weight of it was pressing down on her chest, but it was a good weight. It wasn't the suffocating silence of loneliness. It was the silence of understanding. When she finished, she stood there for a moment, letting her words settle in the air. It wasn't just her story they had heard. It was a story of faith, of struggle, and of the unexpected ways that life could change when you opened yourself up to the possibility of something greater. And then, slowly, the silence began to break. One person clapped, and then another. The sound grew, slowly at first, but then with more urgency, until the entire congregation was on their feet, clapping and cheering. Janelle's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to be celebrated, to be applauded. But here they were, their eyes filled with something more than just pity. They were filled with admiration, with respect, with the kind of love that only a community can give when they see someone truly step into their own power. Father Thomas stepped forward, his voice full of emotion as he addressed the congregation. Janelle's story is a reminder to all of us. It's a reminder that we are never truly alone. That faith, no matter how small, can move mountains. And that sometimes it's not about what we can do alone, but about how we come together as a community to help one another. The applause didn't stop. Janelle stood there, overwhelmed, her face flushed with emotion. She had come here today to share her story, but in doing so, she had received something she never expected. The recognition of a community, the warmth of a group of people who saw her not just as the janitor who cleaned the church, but as someone who had found the strength to rise above her circumstances. And in that moment, she knew something deep in her soul. She was no longer invisible. The congregation's response was more than just applause. It was a shift, a turning point for both Janelle and the people who had listened to her. Her story had touched them in a way they hadn't anticipated. It made them reflect on their own lives, their own faith, and their willingness to give, to offer help without judgment, to see others in their time of need and respond with love. As Janelle stepped down from the pulpit, her heart full and her soul lighter than it had ever been, she realized that this was just the beginning. The journey she had started with a letter to God was far from over, and she was ready to continue walking it with faith, with hope, and with a community by her side. The days that followed Janelle's testimony felt like a dream she wasn't quite ready to wake up from. Everything had changed, or rather, everything was changing in a way she could hardly grasp. The relief she had felt when her financial troubles were lifted by the stranger's donation had barely begun to settle before new opportunities appeared. She had stepped into a new reality, one she never thought possible. Janelle's routine, once a cycle of scrubbing floors and tending to the needs of the church, had shifted in ways she hadn't expected. Morning after her testimony, Father Thomas called her into his office with an offer she couldn't have imagined. "Janelle," he said, his voice kind, but with a hint of excitement. "I've been thinking about how we can support you, not just financially, but in a way that truly aligns with your gifts. You've always worked so hard here, and I know how much you care for this church and for the people in our community. So, I want to offer you a full-time position with us. You'd help with outreach programs, supporting families like yours, and working with the children in our Sunday school. I know you've got the heart for it." Janelle's heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she felt like she had misheard him. A full-time position? Working alongside the church in such a meaningful way? It was something she had never dared to dream of. Not her, the janitor, the woman who cleaned and polished the pews while the world outside passed her by. "Father, I don't know what to say," Janelle stammered, overwhelmed by the enormity of the offer. This is too much. I don't know if I'm qualified for something like that." Father Thomas smiled warmly. "You are more qualified than you think. You have the heart for this work, Janelle, and the community needs you. The way you've cared for it, the way you've carried so much, but never let it break you. That's what makes you perfect for this role." Her mind raced. The idea of helping others, of giving back the way she had been helped, filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't known was missing. This wasn't just a job. It was a calling. It was the answer to the prayer she hadn't even known how to articulate. That night when she went home to Jeremy, she couldn't wait to share the news. She found him sitting at the kitchen table, drawing pictures of superheroes with his crayons. His eyes lit up when she told him about the job offer. "Mom, that's awesome!" he exclaimed, jumping up and running over to her. "You're gonna help so many people." Janelle smiled. a tear slipping down her cheek as she looked at her son. The thought of being able to help others in the same way that had saved them, the way the church had stepped in for them when they needed it most, made her heart swell. Jeremy's health had continued to improve in the days since the donation. His energy was up, his appetite had returned, and his coughs, those relentless hacking coughs that had once kept them both awake for hours, had almost entirely disappeared. He was stronger, more vibrant than he had been in months. Watching him grow healthier by the day was like a balm to her soul, a constant reminder that miracles, big and small, were real. Their life had transformed in so many ways. No longer was Janelle spending sleepless nights wondering how to pay the next bill or whether Jeremy would wake up gasping for air. Instead, she had been given the chance to build something new, a future she had once believed was out of reach. But it wasn't just her life that was changing. As the days went by, it became clear that her role in the church was evolving as well. Gabriel had become a permanent fixture in the church community. He was no longer just a distant benefactor. He was now an active participant in the church's outreach programs, working alongside Janelle to help families who were struggling in the same way she once had. He had found a new sense of purpose, a calling that matched his desire to reconnect with his roots. Gabriel's presence was steady, reassuring, the perfect complement to Janelle's newfound role. They began to work together, creating programs that would provide support to families in need. Gabriel's background in business, coupled with Janelle's deep connection to the community, made them an unstoppable team. Gabriel wasn't just helping others, though. He was helping her, too. They spent hours talking about their pasts, the pain, the mistakes, the lessons learned. But more often than not, they found themselves laughing together. There was something comforting in the way their shared experience had forged a bond between them, something deeper than just charity. It wasn't long before Janelle started to see a new path for herself, one that didn't involve hiding in the background or just scraping by. She was now a part of something bigger, and every time she saw Gabriel helping someone else, offering a hand or lending an ear, she was reminded of the profound difference one act of kindness could make. The changes weren't just external. Janelle could feel the transformation deep inside her. She had spent so many years feeling invisible, carrying her burdens alone, believing that she was unworthy of anything more. But now, with every day that passed, she began to see herself in a new light. Her role in the church wasn't just about doing the work anymore. It was about leading, with compassion, with empathy. It was about offering hope to others in the same way she had been offered it. She could finally see the value in herself, in her journey, and in the power of what it meant to give. Janelle's faith, though small and fragile at times, had been the key that had unlocked her transformation. She had come to realize that faith didn't have to be grand or perfect. It just had to be enough to keep going, even when the way was unclear. And now, as she stood beside Gabriel, working together to make a difference in the lives of others, she understood that her faith had been the spark that ignited this entire new chapter of her life. She no longer felt like the janitor who was invisible. She was a leader, and that leadership was about showing up for herself, for her sister son, for the people who needed help, and for the community that had embraced her with open arms. She had found her purpose, and that purpose was to give, to lead with kindness and compassion, and to never again let herself believe that she was invisible. One late afternoon, after another busy day of planning outreach programs and meeting with families, Janelle sat quietly in the church, looking out over the pews. Jeremy was off with some of the other children, learning about the importance of community service. Gabriel was in the back, organizing supplies for the next food drive. The church was peaceful, a safe place that had become her second home. For the first time in years, Janelle felt content. Her life, though still uncertain in many ways, had transformed into something rich with possibility. Her son was thriving, her faith was restored, and she had a community that truly cared for her. It wasn't a perfect life. It wasn't a life without struggle or pain, but it was hers. And that, she realized, was more than enough. She smiled to herself, a sense of peace settling over her. It wasn't just a miracle that she had received. It was a life redefined. A life that she had once thought was beyond reach, now right in front of her. And she wasn't alone. She had found her place. She had found her family. And that, she thought, was the real miracle. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the hallways of St. Michael's Church, mixing with the hum of activity in the fellowship hall. Janelle stood at the back of the church, her hands folded together, watching the growing bustle of the congregation. What had once been a quiet, sleepy church was now a vibrant, thriving community, alive with energy, hope, and a shared sense of purpose. When she had first come here, all she had known was exhaustion, the long hours spent cleaning, the struggles of being a single mother, and the burden of believing she was alone in her fight. But now, she could see how much had changed, not just for her, but for everyone around her. It wasn't just the physical transformation, though that had been substantial too. The church had expanded its outreach programs, had become a true center of support for the community. Food drives, health initiatives, tutoring programs for the children. All of these efforts were taking root, fed by the generosity of those who had heard Janelle's story and felt compelled to help. The air was thick with possibility, a shared belief in the power of what they could do together. The congregation no longer just filled the pews on Sunday mornings. They were actively engaged, giving back in ways that were changing lives, including their own. The spirit of giving was contagious, spreading like wildfire through the halls of the church and beyond. Janelle had become the face of that transformation. Her story, her faith, and the kindness of the people who had stepped in to help her had ignited something deeper within the church. People were inspired, and they were willing to take action. It was impossible to walk through the church without feeling the change. When Janelle first arrived, she had been just one of many in the background, quietly doing her job. But now, she was a leader, and the shift in her role was palpable. Over the last few months, the church had seen a surge of new members, many of whom had been drawn in by the outreach programs Janelle had helped develop. Families who had once felt isolated now came to the church seeking support, whether it was for financial assistance, food, or just a place to feel safe. What had once been a place of quiet worship had evolved into a sanctuary of healing, a place where people not only found solace for their souls, but practical help for their struggles. Janelle's journey from hardship to hope had become a touchstone for others. The more she worked with the congregation, the more she saw people stepping forward, people who had once been silent and withdrawn, now offering their time and talents to the church's causes. They had seen her transformation and realized that if she could change, so could they. One Thursday afternoon, Janelle stood outside the fellowship hall, watching a group of volunteers sort through donations for the community pantry. It was a steady stream of people, each offering a little bit of what they had. Cans of food, boxes of clothes, donations of toys for children. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was something. And it was enough. Gabriel joined her, standing beside her in quiet solidarity. He had become an integral part of the church's work, not just as a financial donor, but as someone deeply committed to the mission of giving back. Together, they had worked tirelessly to expand the church's outreach programs, and now, the church was a place where people came not just for spiritual guidance, but for practical, hands-on support. Janelle turned to him with a soft smile. "Look at all of them," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "I never thought it would be like this." Gabriel nodded, his gaze sweeping over the bustling room. "You've changed everything, Janelle. Not just for the people who are coming here now, but for all of us. Your faith, it's contagious. People see you, they see what you've overcome, and they want to be a part of it. They want to help." Janelle's heart swelled. There was a time when she had believed that the world was a cold, indifferent place. She had lived in isolation, convinced that no one cared about her or her struggles. But now, standing in the middle of the church she had once cleaned in silence, surrounded by the very people who had been inspired by her journey, she realized just how far she had come. Her relationship with the congregation had deepened in ways she had never expected. She was no longer just the janitor who cleaned the floors. She was their leader, their voice of hope, someone they could look to for guidance and inspiration. Her faith had become a beacon, and it had illuminated the way for others to follow. Every time she spoke, whether it was at a food drive or in one of the church's weekly prayer meetings, people listened. They hung on her words, not because she was some expert, but because they saw her as proof that things could get better. That hope wasn't just a distant dream, but a tangible, living thing that could be achieved through faith and action. And it wasn't just the churchgoers who were being impacted. The outreach programs had begun to spread beyond the walls of the church, reaching people in the broader community who had once been shut out. Families who had never attended St. Michael's Church now came for help. They came for food, for support, for a place to belong. And the church, under Janelle's leadership, welcomed them with open arms. But as much as the transformation was visible in the church, Janelle's personal journey had reached a point of profound change. She had come to understand that the true miracle wasn't just the financial help she had received, or the people who had stepped in to change her circumstances. The miracle was that, through her faith, she had found the strength to give back, to help others in the same way she had been helped. In the months since she had been offered the full-time position at the church, Janelle had begun to realize that her role here wasn't just about giving of her time or resources. It was about giving of herself. It was about showing others that they too had something to offer, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem. Through her work with the children's ministry, she had come to realize the importance of community in a way she hadn't fully understood before. These children, many of them from families struggling to make ends meet, had seen her journey. They had watched as she grew from a quiet woman trying to survive into someone who stood strong in her faith and her mission. And they, too, began to believe in the possibility of change. One afternoon, after a particularly moving Sunday school lesson, Janelle sat with the children in a circle. She listened as they shared their thoughts on the day's lesson, a story of kindness and generosity. As the children spoke, she realized something. She wasn't just teaching them about faith, they were teaching her. Through the eyes of these children, Janelle had come to understand that healing wasn't a solitary endeavor. It wasn't just about one person finding peace or restoration. It was about a collective effort. The church, the community, and even strangers had come together to help her heal. And now, it was her turn to pass that healing on to others. Her role had shifted. No longer was she just a woman who cleaned the church. She was a leader a beacon of hope, a voice for those who felt unheard. And with that responsibility came a deep sense of gratitude and purpose. She no longer saw herself as the broken woman she once was. She saw herself as part of something greater, something that could make a real difference in the lives of others. Janelle walked through the church one afternoon. She paused to look at the bulletin board in the hallway. It was covered in announcements about upcoming events, food drives, fundraisers, community outreach programs. Each one felt like a new opportunity, a new chance to help. But the real change, the real transformation, was happening not just in the programs or in the church building. It was happening in the hearts of the people, in the way they gave, in the way they reached out to each other. It was a shift from individual struggle to collective strength. The church had become more than just a place of worship. It had become a place of healing, a place where people could come not just for spiritual nourishment, but for the practical, emotional, and physical support they needed to move forward. Janelle smiled as she looked at the bulletin board. She had found her purpose. She had found her family. And together, they were healing in ways she never thought possible. Janelle sat quietly in the pew at the back of St. Michael's Church, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The service had just ended, and the congregation had slowly begun to file out. But Janelle remained still, her eyes fixed on the altar at the front of the church. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm, golden glow through the stained glass windows, and for a moment, the church felt like a sanctuary, not just for the body, but for the soul. As the last of the parishioners left, she let herself breathe. It had been a long journey, a journey that had started with desperation and hopelessness, a journey that had led her to places she never thought possible. Her heart swelled as she reflected on everything that had happened. She had come so far, and yet there was still so much ahead. The first time she had walked into this church, it had been nothing more than a place where she worked. It had been a place to clean, to keep the pews shining, to make sure the floors were mopped and the air was still. It was a job, a way to make ends meet. But now, years later, it was her home. She thought back to the night she wrote that letter to God, her heart heavy with fear, exhaustion, and the weight of years spent struggling on her own. She had poured her soul into that letter, asking for a miracle, not knowing if anyone, anything, would hear her desperate cry. The letter was simple, filled with raw emotion, but it was the beginning of everything. "Dear God, I don't know how much more I can take. My son needs help, and I'm running out of time." It was as if those words had opened the door to everything that followed. The donation, the stranger who knew her name, Gabriel's intervention, the church's embrace, her own transformation from a woman simply trying to survive into someone who had found faith, purpose, and, perhaps most importantly, her own voice. She had asked for a miracle, but what she had received had far surpassed anything she had imagined. It wasn't just the money, though that had changed everything. It wasn't just the opportunities that had opened up, though they had given her a new life. The true miracle had been the restoration of her faith, the realization that even in the darkest moments, when everything seemed lost, there was a light, a flicker of hope that, when nurtured, could grow into something powerful. Over the months, Janelle had learned something profound. Miracles didn't always come in the grand gestures or the dramatic moments. Sometimes, they arrived in quiet, small acts of faith, the faith to keep going even when you didn't know what the next day would bring, the faith to reach out to someone when you felt like you had nothing left to give, the faith to believe in yourself when the world seemed determined to make you believe you were invisible. Her life, and the life of her son had been transformed by the simplest acts of faith: the letter she had written, the kind stranger who answered it, and the love and support that had followed. In her darkest moments, when she had felt most alone, the universe had conspired to send her a reminder that she wasn't. Now, standing in the church, Janelle saw that miracle reflected in the faces of everyone around her. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all of them: the congregation, the community that had come together, the families that had found help, the children whose laughter filled the hallways. It was about a transformation that had reached far beyond her own life and rippled out into the lives of others. The journey had been long, filled with pain, uncertainty, and doubt. But it had also been filled with grace, hope, and love. Things Janelle had once thought were out of her reach. And now, she understood something that had eluded her for so long. Faith, no matter how small, can move mountains. It was the Sunday after her last testimony, the one where she had stood before the congregation and shared her story of struggle and transformation. As she stood at the back of the church, watching the last of the parishioners filter out, Janelle knew that her journey wasn't over. There was still more to do, more people to help, more lives to touch. But what had truly struck her was the silence that had followed her testimony. When she had finished speaking, there hadn't been applause. There hadn't been cheering or even clapping. There had been only silence. Deep, heavy silence. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from awkwardness or uncertainty. No, it was something far more powerful. The congregation, as one, had absorbed her words in silence because they understood. In that moment, they weren't just listening to her story. They were seeing something, a truth that had resonated deeply with all of them. They had witnessed the impossible become possible. They had seen the way Janelle's faith had transformed not just her life, but the lives of those around her. They had witnessed the power of a small, humble act of faith and how it could ripple out into something much larger. Janelle could feel it in the air that morning, the quiet hum of collective understanding. It wasn't awe, exactly. It was something more profound, the shared recognition that faith, no matter how small, had the power to change everything. The congregation had seen it, had felt it, and now they too were changed. They had become a part of her miracle. Janelle's gaze drifted across the empty church, the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. For the first time, she allowed herself to reflect on the full extent of the changes in her life. She wasn't just the woman who had been saved by a miracle. She had become an active participant in that miracle, a conduit through which faith, hope, and love flowed freely. There had been a time when she thought she was invisible, when she believed that no one saw her struggles, her pain, or her sacrifice. But now, she knew better. She had been seen all along, not just by the stranger who had stepped in to help her, but by the people who truly mattered, the ones who loved her, the ones who helped her, and the ones who had seen the goodness in her when she couldn't see it in herself. Her heart swelled with gratitude, not just for what had been given to her, but for what she had been able to give in return. She wasn't just helping others, she was leading. She was creating spaces where people could find hope, where they could see the possibilities in their own lives, even when everything felt impossible. Janelle's journey had been one of quiet strength, and she realized now that it wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving. It was about finding the courage to live authentically, to reach out, and to help others. And in doing so, she had helped herself. The church had become a place of healing for her, but it had become something more, a community of people who had come together to offer love and support, who had witnessed the miracle of transformation, and who had learned the powerful lesson that faith, even in its smallest form, could indeed move mountains. Janelle took a deep breath, looking around the church with new eyes. The weight of everything she had experienced, the hardships, the miracles, the love, settled comfortably in her heart. And as she walked toward the door, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The road ahead was still uncertain, still full of challenges, but she knew she would face it with the strength she had found within herself, and with the faith that had carried her this far. As she stepped outside, the soft breeze caressed her face, and she looked up at the sky, her heart full of hope. Miracles didn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes they arrived in quiet moments, in acts of faith, in the simplest of choices, in the willingness to believe that there was something more. And Janelle knew, without a doubt, that she had found it. The future was bright, and it was hers to embrace. What you just listened to isn't just a story. It's a reflection of life's most powerful moments, the ones we never see coming, the choices we make, the consequences that follow. But most of all, how one action can echo through everything. If you felt something deep within you, something that still lingers, subscribe now. Join us for more stories that aren't just meant to be told, but lived. Because the hardest truths are often the ones we're most afraid to face. So the question is, what if Janelle didn't go to church that very day? What if she didn't take the necessary steps that brought about the change she so desperately needed? We just may never know. Please, tag along with us for more stories tomorrow. See you around, and also do not forget to subscribe and comment.